The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 7 completed. Chapter 7. The gods punished us, and then chaos ensued for us. To contain the accursed, a group of wizards risked their lives to recover the ancient grimoires. Thanks to them they were able to build the magic wall that isolated the city. The cost was high. The magicians who survived the ritual decided to create a magic order to preserve the knowledge of grimoires in times of need. Thus was the origin of the Great Order of the White Robes. White Robes. Fidorus Magnus. Vanus woke her up the next day with his usual whisper. Arian was quite tired from the previous day. The servants offered her a hearty breakfast from which she only took a little milk with honey and some fruit. He dressed in a loose light blue tunic, typical of the place, then put on simple fabric sandals that were very comfortable. With her hair tied back with a white silk ribbon, she decided to leave her room. It was early and a bit cool, but the temperature was pleasant. His room was next to a large terrace, from which he could see the entire royal palace. The sky was completely clear and the sun was shining brightly, so Arian could see clearly the countless gardens, the spectacular fountains and the various mansions that made up the royal palace. It could be summed up in the sum of many palaces within a wall. Arian was in the largest of them all, where the royal family resided and with a more spectacular construction, adorned with gold and immense precious stones. Around this palace were smaller palaces. From his vantage point, Arian could observe the other structures. Arian then noticed a small two-story mansion located on his left. It was where the mercenaries were staying. To his surprise, despite his turns during the previous night, it was right next to his room. "I just had to jump over the wall and I was in the other palace." The young woman laughed at herself. She was able to survive without problems in a wild forest, but she was a disaster to orient herself inside a dream palace. He was able to observe the palace in detail. It had a large interior courtyard with a beautiful garden, full of weapons and shields placed in great order, ready for combat. In the center there was a small fountain that had the statue of a seated dragon. The two half-orcs went out into the courtyard. Arian crouched like a thief, not wanting to be caught spying again. Aris and Agnorok had met at dawn. They had many things in common but also too many differences. What they both agreed on was their obsession with sword training. Among the orcs the art of fencing was something inculcated from birth from father to son. It was a religion for them, so much so that they had created a myth, the Asura. When an orc reached such a degree of perfection in the art of fighting, he was given the title of Asura and was regarded as the living reincarnation of the goddess of war. It was a far greater privilege than being a king or head of a clan. But it had been millennia since anyone had been worthy of being named Asura, since the Wars of Exile. If among the orcs the art of fighting well was a religion, among the white orcs it was something taken to the limit. The last Asura named was a member of his tribe, and that was an honor they all had in their blood. They both had Sinafti blood. They both got up at dawn to practice, and one day it occurred to them that it wouldn't hurt in one morning to have a sword duel, without blood of course. As they did not want to publicize the duel, they decided that the best time would be the morning after the king's dinner of honor, when the rest of the mercenaries would sleep much more, as a result of the party. Both advanced barefoot, wearing only their mercenary pants, as the orcish tradition dictated. Their chests were totally uncovered. The two brandished wooden swords. Although both had steel longswords as their favorite weapon, Agnorok had never been exquisite with his taste. Aris, however, usually wielded a sword of a higher quality, a personal gift from the emperor on the day he was promoted to general, custom made by the best blacksmiths of the Black Empire, blue steel purchased from the dwarfs of the dragon's dorsal. Perfectly balanced and a pommel decorated with a dragon's head, his two eyes were black amethysts, and carved on his head a legend in common orc that read, "The Black General." And I missed her now. The two warriors advanced to the middle of the courtyard, made a series of warm-up blows in the air. As we had agreed, in the best of two touches, The blow that must be fatal is marked for it to count as a point, understood? Aris spoke while he concentrated. You had to have a lot of self-control in this type of duels, despite the wooden swords. Letting yourself be carried away by the momentum could imply a mistake that could cost death or a very serious injury. Agnorok nodded and stood on guard. Who taught you? Aris asked. My father and a blind dwarf, the rest went through combat. Aris smiled. He had learned from his father, other orc warriors and the best instructors of the Black Empire. He had had an impeccable training. However, Agnorok, though rough in his movements, had something different from the rest. They began to spin around the courtyard. The morning had begun. They weren't alone. A petite, silver-grey figure came out onto the deck. It was Gosberg. He gave a big yawn before lighting a cigarette. The two opponents looked at Gosberg with some anger. The Denka scratched his ass in response. How did you hear about Gosberg? I find out everything that interests me. It's a simple workout, replied Aris, concentrating. You also need a referee to mark the touches. The two half-orcs looked at each other with some condescension. Gosberg wasn't going to leave, so they both agreed that the Denka would be the referee. Get started at once, shouted the Denka. The two rivals continued to spin around each other, studying each other, while Gosberg smoked long puffs. I want sword strikes now. It's not a fairy duel, Gosberg protested. Arian sat up a bit to watch the duel more comfortably, even if it made her reveal her position. Vanus joined her as a spectator. Gosberg's cry caught the attention of some other mercenary who was already awake. They went to the courtyard and the word began to spread between the barracks. In 2 minutes the courtyard was full of mercenaries. No one wanted to miss the duel. And even though they hadn't exchanged a single blow, they were still studying each other. Agnorok decided to initiate hostilities by striking a frontal greatsword that was well countered by the sword of Aris. Agnorok recognized, after the clash of swords, the quality of Aris' defense, which had crouched to absorb the energy of his blow. Aris then counterattacked with a direct blow to Agnorok's ribs, who dodged the attack by leaping backwards. But Aris expected that move, and with a nimble sweep of his feet he knocked the other half-orc to the ground and the tip of the wooden sword touched Agnorok's apple. Aris 1, Agnorok 0, Gosberg said as Aris helped Agnorok get back on his feet. Applause from all the mercenaries. Aris was their favorite, the leader and famous warrior, while Agnorok was only known for his reputation for getting into trouble during the period of training in Almera and being the protégé of Gosberg, which caused him a lot of envy. Gosberg clapped his hands. Now he was accompanied by Kritus and Kush. Improved since the last time Aris and your Agnorok wake up. Agnorok wiped his trousers and picked up his sword, shot an angry look at Gosberg. It was clear that he was fighting away from home. Arian was glad of Aris' victory, although Agnorok was also worried. The truth is that Aris was his favorite. All against Agnorok, the half-orc concentrated again. Aris smiled. One more touch and the duel would be his. They began to spin around. For troll shit, and Agnorok attacked with everything. Aris and the other mercenaries in the company were experienced warriors and hard to impress, but this time they were amazed. Agnorok's attack wasn't like the first, now it was like a storm out of hell. Aris was completely dismasted. His sword could only hold off the blows of his opponent and he had to retreat as best he could. He had never seen anything like it. The rapidity of the thrusts was not out of this world. He didn't even notice when his sword flew out of his hands for the first time in years after a blow from Agnorok, the edge of the other sword now touching the Aris nut. 1-on-1. Agnorok said as he handed over the sword fell from Aris. While the spectators stood in silence in amazement. Aris shook his head. It was true. Aris never thought the rumors were true, especially in a ragged warrior who had been rescued from a death sentence. Son of a deserted white orc. Agnorok had slain the king of the vampires. Those beings of darkness were very tough. Aris recalled that he once had to go to a fort on the eastern border of the empire for a vampire infestation and had to fight a newly infected young vampire. he had a hard time taking it down. Thanks to the Emperor's mags, they were able to get rid of these parasites. But if a young vampire who barely had power was already a formidable foe, Aris couldn't think of the extraordinary capabilities of the first of them, the king of vampires. Someone who had existed since the first age in Ragnarok was the one who defeated him, or so they said. There was still the last round, the final round, the one that would decide the winner. Aris knew he had to do his best, Ragnarok knew the same. As always, Ragnarok went on the attack, a new hell broke loose on the earth, but this time the old black general was prepared and managed to contain all the attacks of his rival with effort. But this time Aris maintained his defensive position. The mercenaries began to encourage the two contenders. Aris decided to go on the offensive and applied himself just as well as Ragnarok, who had to retreat a little to avoid being killed. The last round remained, as after a long sword swing the two took distance. They were exhausted. "Quit before you get hurt," Kush recommended, but the two duelists ignored him. The duel had to end with a victor. Ragnarok raised his head, watched Arian watching the fight on the terrace. It was a second, something stirred inside him and he didn't concentrate to the maximum, he got distracted. Aris was attentive. Ragnarok had let his guard down for a moment. Aris' attack was magnificent, Ragnarok retreating until he saw a weak spot in Aris' guard and kicked him with his right foot. It was a bad idea. That loss of concentration had been a key mistake. That weak point was a trap for Aris to do just that. Aris swept Ragnarok's support leg, he fell to the ground, and felt the tip of Aris' sword lightly touch his apple again. 2 Aris, 1 Ragnarok. Victoria Aris. Applause and more applause before a vibrant match. Arian clenched his fist as a sign of joy while Vanus kicked a stone. Aris helped Ragnarok to his feet and made the other half-orc raise his hand next to his immediately. They were surrounded by all their companions to congratulate them. Perhaps Ragnarok had lost the fight. From now on he would be treated as one of them. He would never lack the help or companionship of those mercenaries even if he left the company. And in time everyone who was a spectator of the duel would tell it to family and friends. That duel with wooden swords became a legend within the mercenary company. In the afternoon, Arian and Vanus had a private audience with His Majesty. The king offered to be at his service for as long as they saw fit. Arian declined the monarch's offer. He had personal matters to settle and the Kendali did the same. His fate was linked to Arian's. This was a huge disappointment for Her Majesty, but incredibly she accepted it willingly. The gates of the kingdom of Demember would always be open to them. Now Arian had to convince the mercenaries to accept his company on the journey to Tripulia and knew who to talk to, Kush the magician. She found him in the afternoon in the king's library looking for new knowledge. Arian found him leafing through the annals of the kingdom of Demember. As usual by his side he had his book, with the last pages were blank where Kush was taking notes with a golden pen. Wizards never get tired of studying and reading. Kush raised his head and smiled slightly as was customary for him. The history of Demember is very interesting to understand the growth of Olbiana. I have some gaps about it and this library allows me to fix them. Is it of any use? Kush stopped writing and looked at the young woman closely, evidently in the library talking for some reason. If it's of any use. I'm going to be honest with you, it's more personal interest in the story of Shanaris than anything else. A word of advice, learning new things never hurts. It was good advice. Arian sat down in front of the wizard and looked at all the books he had open. The young woman tried to look at something but Arian knew how to read the basics. It was difficult for him, but also all the books were written in a language he did not understand. Also next to the books there were a lot of scrolls that looked like they were authentic relics. Arian, I doubt you've come to consult ancient scrolls from the history of Demember. I need help. The magician raised his head again. Kush, like the rest of the mercenaries, wondered what the hell was this girl doing here. Vanus's story was very clear. Gosberg and Ragnarok had informed him. There was not much information about Arian except that he helped them at Tame with the king of Demember and that he came from the northern free lands on the continent of Tergir. The magician knew little of that continent. From what was said, there were some very interesting ruins, the Towers of Oblivion, and also located in the north was the mysterious kingdom of Bursary. Another interesting fact is that throughout Tergir there were remains of the constructions of the First Era. Someday he would like to visit them because the First Age was a subject that obsessed Kush. What do you need? Allow me to accompany you on your journey to Tripulia. Kush was silent. Tripulia was not a city for a young woman. The city of magic was spectacular with its great towers that were lost in the clouds. Something so spectacular that the city seemed like a dream come true, but it was only a mirage since away from the clouds in the streets it was a corrupt and sordid place, full of intrigues and conspiracies between the different orders of wizards, students, and vendors who had any ingredient, potion or contraption necessary for their spells and rituals. The magician did not like Tripulia. In fact, he was only twice obliged. Being a magician who was not attached to any order of magic, he had to register in the register of the Great Council and then pass a kind of exam, where they made sure that he was not a necromancer. Death magic was absolutely forbidden, although it was rumored that many grandmasters practiced it in secret. Tripulia was a place full of hypocrisy. Kush had not answered Arian's request. The young woman was impatient with Kush's silence, so she wanted to give an additional reason to convince the magician. My brother is studying there and I want to go visit him. The magician thought that Arian was sincere, although she did not tell the whole truth. But he could not decide whether or not to accept the request. The one who commanded the expedition was Aris. Surely he would not hinder the journey. Getting to Tripulia from Demember was easy. Since the truce after the Iron Wars, it was not a conflict zone. I don't think there will be any problems, but I have to ask Aris. If you come, the most likely thing is that the Kendali will also accompany us. Arian was overjoyed and nodded, hugged the wizard, and retreated to his quarters. After dinner, Arian and Vanus returned to their rooms and found Gosberg lying quietly on Arian's bed. The Denker did not seem to have any respect for his privacy. What are you doing here? Arian asked, somewhat annoyed. Because you have refused His Majesty's offer. It's a pity, Your Highness held you in high regard. Gosberg, as usual, maintained his carefree tone and played with one of the lightstones given by the king. How do you know that? Normally on the walls of castles they are full of curious ears, and in this royal palace they are the size of a mountain ogre. Arian smiled for a moment and sat down in the corner of the bed. It's true, we've turned down the offer since I have to travel south. Destination Tripulia. Arian looked askance at Gosberg. She hadn't commented on her intention to go to that city with anyone or about her brother's existence. Kush has told Aris and me about your request. We have agreed to have you join us in Tripulia. Once there we will separate, we have a mission to fulfill. Arian was so happy that he hugged Gosberg tightly, and the Denker, surprised by so much effusiveness, dropped the stone of light. After regaining his composure, Gosberg got up to leave the room. We leave in 2 days, so get ready for the trip. So saying, Gosberg disappeared humming down the hall. Arian was left alone with the Kendali. The young woman smiled satisfied now she was sure she would go to Tripulia. She didn't really care what the mercenaries thought of her. In a few days he would meet his brother and warn him of the great danger he was in because of that blue jewel. The king gave the young women all the material they needed to make the journey. Almost all of the mercenaries would ride except for those who would travel in a wagon, which would be the orcs, the dwarf, and Vanus. Arian would ride the mule even though he didn't know and would have to learn during the march. Luckily Kiona was a very docile and intelligent mule. He just needed to talk. Agnorok was also forced to ride a horse. He didn't like it at all, but there was no room in the wagon, so he had to obey Aris' order. While a small garrison of mercenaries remained in Demember as the monarch's personal protection, the bulk of them would leave in 2 days for the east to embark for Almera. The expedition to Tripulia consisted of a Cushman, 2 half-orcs, Aris and Agnorok, 3 orcs who were cousins of Aris and who were never separated from Aris by order of their father. Their names were Ulak, Gulak and Mulak. Arian seemed to him to be the same. A dwarf Kritus and 2 Denkis, one of them was Gosberg and the other was the only member of the expedition who walked. He just couldn't fit in the wagon. He was a giant, huge. A snow troll would think twice before attacking him. His name was Sabu. The Denka was over 3 meters. He was a short-haired, silver-gray, and muscular hulk. His gaze was serious and he was always clinging to his double-edged axe, and unlike his father he was very untalkative. The group was completed by Arian and Vanus. The expedition began the march, Arian riding Kiona with some difficulty. While the orcs, the dwarf, and Vanus rode in the wagon, the rest except Sabu rode on horseback. Everyone was wearing light clothes. The heat in Demember was important. Vanus spurred on the horses pulling the wagon and the group set off, followed by Sabu who closed the group with his terrifying bearing. Advancing through the arid Demember of the south, Arian saw that this area of the kingdom was less inhabited than the north, although there were some small villages scattered among some small forests that were gradually emerging. Shortly before dusk they decided to camp on the side of the road. As was typical in Demember, they used an awning that the wagon had to set up a kind of tent. They lit a small fire around which they sat down. Although it was a summer's day in those desert places, it was cool at night and a little warmth was appreciated. The mercenaries placed a small cauldron on top of the flames of the campfire, and filled it with water, and when it began to boil they added a little like some green flour. Poof, Gramina, no please. Gosberg complained disgusted when he saw how the food was being prepared. The rest of the mercenaries smiled at the Denka's complaints since it was not the first time he had protested about the dinner. Grass! Arian exclaimed in surprise. It is a mixture of cereals, a little honey, a piece of dried figs, all ground and dehydrated, water is added and something similar to a porridge is formed. Kush explained. That's what you eat. Arian thought that this couldn't feed such strong warriors for a whole day. Yuck, that's what it is, with how delicious a roast duck is. Gosberg complained again, looking contemptuously at the cauldron. You have a supernatural aim, you could hunt aglo instead of smoking all day. The dwarf protested about the Denka's complaints as he stared disdainfully at the bowl of Gramina. The dwarf was not enthusiastic about it either. Aris was the one who was cooking, watching the cauldron so that the Gramina did not stick and pouring a bowl to overflowing to each one. Gramina is the field food of the orcs. With a handful of this flour and a little water you feed 2 orcs for a whole day. It is so good that the Black Empire incorporated it as the food of all its legions. It has everything the body needs. Its taste is not unpleasant, I would even say it is somewhat tasteless. But to give your opinion, try it for yourself. He poured a bowl for Arian. Taking. Arian looked at the bowl with some suspicion. It had a jelly-like appearance. A tasteless smell, it was a somewhat strange mush. The rest of the group looked at the young woman expectantly. Kush offered her a spoon, picked up some of the grass, looked at it again suspiciously, but finally tasted the food. It burned, so much so that she had to spit out the contents to the laughter of the mercenaries. Be careful, burn a little. Agnorak said with a laugh. Gosberg offered him some wine in a bottle. Arian drank some, once he recovered from the burn and made sure the grass was cold. At the end he tasted a little of the content of the story and gave his verdict. Not bad, although I think with some seasoning it would improve its flavor quite a bit. The dinner passed in silence, each one immersed in his thoughts. The one who dined avidly was the Kendali, who seemed to like the grass as much as those who had orc blood. Then each one curled up in his blanket, except for Agnorak, who asked to be the first to do the guard shift. He was left alone, as always, watching the stars in the light of the blue moon, which rained that night. They woke up at dawn, a quick breakfast that consisted of some fruit and some cookies. At noon they saw a large blue stone monolith with the coat of arms of Demember, a large diamond inside a hexagon. It was the sign that they were on the southern border bordering Olbiana. A garrison from Demember guarded the pass, but they were too busy with their own affairs that foreigners who intended to leave the kingdom, they were not asked, they were too far from their homes. However, the landscape began to become much more fertile. The road continued along the banks of the White River. They had a safe water supply and the weather during the trip would be more pleasant. From time to time small villages appeared whose inhabitants depended on the river for their total subsistence. The trees on the bank were abundant and the group used to rest under its shade to eat and sleep a little. They were a very beautiful place, but the villages were small and very scattered despite being quite fertile and rich land but full of many ruins, even with human remains strewn about. Arian didn't want to talk about what he was seeing, but his curiosity had to be satisfied. What happened here? Arian asked directly to the magician. Kush was riding next to him. He didn't know what to answer. Aris approached, as he was at the end of the group, and placed himself parallel to the two. The Iron Wars. A long time ago the dwarfs invaded some mines east of Demember. They were defeated by the grandfather of the current king. That was the First Iron War. 30 years ago they did the same thing again in the north, but this time the conflict was on a large scale. In support of Demember many kingdoms of the Dragon's Ridge allied except for one that betrayed them, Albiona. The dwarfs and the Jewel of the South had made a pact to divide the whole of the ridge, the dwarfs the interior of the earth and the great Albiona the surface. That was the Second Iron War, and again that the company of the Blue Phoenix was put into the service of the crown of Demember. That's why the king looks for iron so far north. Interrupted Arian. If you're curious, they're called Iron Wars, but Demember is rich in minerals but not iron. It was a long and bloody war. The dwarfs did not advance much. The Blue Phoenix Company under De Boek and Gosberg in the mines achieved great victories for Demember. But on the surface things were different. Albiona was vastly superior. The mercenaries in wide spaces could not stand up to the numerical superiority of the soldiers of the Southern Jewel, and the coalition suffered defeat after defeat. Albiona went as far as he wanted. And he stood here, in the South Pass, next to the forest of Fambir. As the dwarfs were defeated, Albiona's iron supply was halted, but Albiona had defeated the Dragon's Ridge League. A peace treaty was signed, where Albiona consolidated all the conquered territories to the south. The dwarfs won some mines from Demember but unimportant, and it was for them a defeat. Albiona's new domains were called New Albiona. Arian saw in the background the Winged Mountains to the west and the forest of Fambir to the east, dividing them the White River in the middle of a narrow plain, called the Southern Pass. So now this area is at peace. Aris looked at the horizon with a certain irony. Albiona has gained ground in the north, but as you can see he does not pay much attention to it. He has some garrison but little else. Even so he has tasted the taste of victory. Demember is next door. It is a small and desirable kingdom, rich in mines full of precious stones. It is only a matter of time before it tries to conquer it. Is that why the king wants the supply of iron? Yes, sooner or later there will be war, and the League of Kingdoms of the Dragon's Back will defend Demember against Albiona, and this time Albiona will not stop until he conquers them all. Sad is the fate that awaits this beautiful place. Arian lamented. The war had only brought misery to this beautiful place. Agnorok, who had been listening to the conversation, approached Arian, who had a sad expression, and wanted to comfort her. Arian, don't worry about what can happen, it's a waste of time, you must focus on what is happening right now. The young woman was silent. Agnorok's words were wise. She should focus on saving her brother right now. What happened to the dragon's dorsal was secondary. They decided to camp in the ruins of an ancient fort. The next morning they would enter the domains of the great kingdom of Albiona proper. The Southern Pass was the name given to a small plain that separated the ranges of the Winged Mountains with the forest of Fambir. It was the natural border of Albiona, the group advancing slowly along the river that crossed the middle of the plain. Arian had some reservations. Aris and his party had worked for the king of Demember, which was not a kingdom allied with Albiona, so they might have trouble getting into Albiona, but the mercenaries were very calm. When they reached the pass, the plain narrowed only 200 meters wide. They arrived at the Southern Pass. A low wall, barely 2 meters high, occupied the entire width of the pass, with a small open gate where the southern path passed. the war reminded him of the passage of Loa but vaguely. They met a small garrison of soldiers who, as those of Demember were too busy hating their fate, Albiona had not closed borders, they were only meant to indicate that the great kingdom of the south began there. They spent the night as far away as possible from the garrison. They did not trust the soldiers. There were rumors that some of them were looking for extra income at night to their meager salaries, and smuggling in this area was almost non-existent. This time the watch shift was double. Aris thought that any precaution was too little. As always, they made a fire and prepared the grass for dinner. Arian was still thinking about the Iron Wars. I don't understand why they made war. Agnorak smiled. For the same thing as all of them, gold. But Albiona doesn't seem very interested in the territories he won in the Iron Wars. Kush smiled before answering. It wasn't what I wanted, it was the mines of Demember. By the end of the war his kingdom was ruined in spite of the victory and however great the booty obtained. Ordinary people hated this war despite the victory. So when the crown asked for settlers to repopulate New Albiona, they didn't get many volunteers. The inhabitants of Albiona considered it to be a cursed place, inhabited only by those banished by convictions or people who are not originally from Albiona and have no better place to go. In addition, trade with the rest of the Dragon Ridge realms with New Albiona does not exist. It is doomed to be a dead zone where nature is now reborn. War is a waste. Agnorak drank some wine. Arian saw the blue moon rise over the White River. You are mercenaries, you make your living from war. That's why we know that war is just a trade. Kingdoms rise up against each other for whatever reason, but in the end it's the third that wins and everyone else loses. Everyone nodded to Agnorak's words, they had blank stares remembering the past. But you're still mercenaries. You know that war is bad, you continue to kill. Why? Silence fell over everyone, they lowered their heads. No one knew what to say. Agnorak got up to perform the first shift of duty next to Gosberg and added only one more sentence. It's the only thing we know how to do well. The following days became heavy despite the fact that villages and towns sprang up from every corner. It was a fertile land and here the settlers had occupied the province fleeing from the overpopulated south. The looks they received were not friendly. In the north indifference or curiosity was the tendency but not here. Any traveler from the north was treated with great suspicion despite the fact that the war had ended a long time ago. A new war would end with the prosperity achieved in recent times. They camped next to the Great Bridge of King Nuemir II, built by this great king 400 years ago on the remains of the old bridge destroyed after a great flood of the Rio Blanco. Now that they were approaching Tripulia, the morale of the group improved a little. The one who did the most to raise the mood was the Denkka, who was always told some strange story by the light of the bonfire accompanied by a bottle of wine. Of all the ones that Arian told, always remembered that night. It all started with Kush talking to the young woman about the magic orders. Magic orders arose at the beginning of this era. After the punishment, the cursed advanced through the world like poison, transmitting their infection. Luckily, a group of wizards came together to create a magical war like the one the gods did in the first era after Elmerd's betrayal. With great sacrifices they managed to perform the ritual and the curse was contained. To prevent the ancient knowledge from being lost, the magicians decided to create a magic order where the ancient scrolls could be kept and to be able to instruct new magicians to be prepared for another new crisis. Those magicians decided to wear a white robe and thus the Order of the White Robes was created. The king of Albiona, which was already an important kingdom at the time, gave the order an ancient tower in which a powerful wizard had dwelt. The tower was located in the city of Tripulia. Over time the call effect made many mags go there to be instructed, but to belong to the order the requirements were very strict and with a maximum demand and many were rejected. These were taken in by other mags and other orders were created that built their own towers. In order to have control over the activities of the orders of magicians, the Council of Orders of Magicians was created. What does the council do? Mediate between the different orders if there are conflicts, make sure that the mags do not cast forbidden spells, Forbidden spells. Necromancy is prohibited. Revive the dead. It's more complex than that. Using the dead or sacrificing them to gain power is forbidden by Thani, the goddess of death. And magicians are careful not to anger her. Thani, the goddess of death. In Caesarea her cult was abandoned like all gods since the punishment, yet some people prayed for the dead and their good rest. She is said to be vengeful to those who refuse to escape her clutches, but these are just legends. Necromancy is punishable by death in honor of Thani. Still, some magicians can't resist death magic because the power it gives is enormous. As the necromancer Aldomir. Kush was surprised to see that Arian knew that name. The necromancer Aldomir was never caught by the Council of Wizards. Gosberg sat down next to Arian, pushed the grass bowl aside, and drank some wine. That damn one day will pay for his crimes. Him and his accursed disciples. Arian showed a look of surprise and Gosberg saw that the young woman wanted to know more. Aldomir, before taking refuge in his ice palace, had another fortress. There came those who wanted to learn the dark arts. Many of them became victims of the necromancer, but a few were worthy students of the necromancer, although one of them was especially mediocre in the art of reviving the dead, so much so that Aldomir himself tried to assassinate him, but the young man survived and discovered that he had a special talent for resurrecting corpses of dead vegetables. Dead vegetables? Yes, his name was Azibuin Nosha. They called him the King of Onions. Arian spat out the grass with laughter. I don't believe it. Which is true, the accursed one recovered from the assassination attempt on Aldomir and managed to obtain great power. He was able to corrupt dead vegetables and transform them into horrible creatures. He had a special gift with onions. Laughter from everyone, that was sovereign stupidity. Until Agnorok, who was the only one who wasn't laughing, approached Gosberg. The War of the Killer Onions. Yes, that's what they called it in some places. Aris regained his composure. It was not believed that Agnorok would play along with Denka. But what do you say, Agnorok? Gosberg doesn't lie, it really happened, although I didn't know that the cause had been a necromancer. It happened when I was little. Where I lived I was attacked by an army of murderous onions. It was not a joke, and also while standing guard one night a night assailant kicked my ass. And what happened? In an attack the onions stopped walking and stayed there until they rotted. Gosberg got up. And it was thanks to me. Azibuin Nosha wanted to dominate the world with his creations and take revenge on his master. But I and some associates put an end to him and his evil plan. Everyone stared at Gosberg. He had saved the world from an invasion of living dead onions. And Aldomir? That old is rotting in his fortress waiting for me to come back. The Denka finished the contents of the bottle and together with Agnorok began the first shift of guard. They had continued to work double shifts since they had entered Olbiana. The next morning they crossed the White River and bade it farewell to the east of Olbiana. After 2 days they saw the towers of Tripulia on the horizon. Arian was glad, he was close to his goal. Kush was ahead of the group. Here is Tripulia, the city of magic, where everything can happen, both good and bad. I'll give you a piece of advice, try to stay out of the wizard's affairs. Well, we're going to deal with a magician business. Gosberg pointed out very sharply. Kush cast an unfriendly glance at the Denka. The city was surrounded by a wall, but they were more for ornamental reasons, since it lacked a defensive function and it was noticeable in that it lacked watchtowers and battlements, but it was a robust construction. Arian found a city very different from the previous ones he had visited. Tripulia had been the capital of magic in Shanaris for centuries. It had the status of a city-state, although it did not care much about the politics of the neighboring kingdoms. An example in the Iron Wars, it was neutral, despite the requests of Olbiana or the League of Dorsal Del Dragon for the Mags members of each kingdom to help in the war, but the Council of Mags was neutral, forbidding any Mags from Tripulia to intervene in the war. Tripulia within the kingdom of Olbiana maintained a great independence. It had no governor from the Jewel of the South, although it maintained a small garrison, but they were only there to keep up appearances. The city was governed by the Council of Magicians, which was composed of the Grand Master of each order of magic, and from among all of them they chose who would preside over the Grand Council, which was usually a position for life. The Great Council, apart from governing the city, was the one that regulated and controlled all the mags of the world, at least in theory. Kush, for example, was not subject to any orders from Tripulia and yet went to register at the council headquarters because he respected its authority. Tripulia was a place where there were libraries, registries, shops, markets that contained books, papyri, crystals, ingredients, minerals, spices to prepare spells and potions to perfect their art. It must be said that all these activities of the city had to pay a tribute to the Council of Mags, and part of these benefits were given annually to Olbiana in exchange for maintaining that certain independence. Arian stared at the city closely, the walls barely able to contain the towers that rose to the sky, plunging large areas of the city into gloom throughout the day. In their path were hundreds of figures wearing robes of all kinds and colors, much like the one Kush wore. Many walked hooded and in silence to go unnoticed, others jovial laughed in groups and performed the occasional funny magic trick. These were the apprentice magicians who returned from their homes to the magic academies to continue their studies. Kush smiled at the sight of the young apprentices. It reminds you of other times. Yes, but it's been a long time and a long way off. Beyond the oceans of glass. Arian watched the wizard in silence as they advanced. Each member of the company was different from the others. They all kept their story to themselves, but none of them seemed to be mercenaries by choice, except for Gosberg. Kush walked away from the young woman looking sad. For the first time Arian felt guilty for having reminded him of something unfortunate. Don't blame yourself, Arian. Arian turned. It was Aris who was speaking to him. Bye. It is hard to have to leave your kingdom and have your family dishonored for eternity. How sad, I didn't know. We are all more or less here because of a misfortune that forced us to abandon our old life. The banishment of the Emperor? Yes, it's a much more complicated issue. The Emperor betrayed the Black Empire to accede to the throne, causing the death of my father and my comrades in arms. I am sorry. Nothing can be done to it at the moment. Orcs too? They fulfill a promise made by their father and mine, to protect my life until death. The dwarf. Krytus, when his kingdom was invaded by the Stufos, the dwarfs of the Brown Hills began an exodus. They could not bear to live with the dwarfs of the Dragon's Ridge. Some sought accommodation within the Dark Empire. Others went north and west as blacksmiths and stonemasons, since in those arts they are always well valued. Fewer offer their services as mercenaries, as in the case of Krytus. But he has not overcome defeat. He refuses to grow a beard and long hair like the rest of the dwarfs until he reconquers the Brown Hills. And will that happen? It's easiest for Gosberg to drink only water for a week. The young woman stared at the orcs, and the half-orc, who had given up riding days ago, talked quietly as Krytus cleaned his repeating crossbow without paying attention to what was going on around him. Vanus was the one who drove the wagon now. The Kendeli was very used to traveling this way with her parents and drove much better than the dwarf, since she was very adept at dodging all the potholes and potholes. So you are all here because you have lost what you loved most. The half-orc looked at Arian with some bitterness. Yes, all but one. The couple's eyes fell on the small Denka who was engaged in a conversation with a merchant with whom they shared a fate, while the huge Denka walked closing the procession, lowering his head at the comments that arose about his large size. Where does Gosberg come from? No one really knows. Who is he? I don't know, I just know that I was already part of the company long before I joined it. And the other one? It's huge. Sabu had to move carefully, dodging people. An unintentional stomp, and it could be a drama, even though everyone was moving away. He is his adopted son's Vladimir Sabu. He is only 10 years old. Arian stopped riding. He couldn't believe it, that huge Denka was the age of a child. Aris gave a sarcastic look at the young woman who was not used to a world where she was barely over 10 years old and an adult. For the half-orc, if it was normal for an orc at the age of 10 to pass initiation, at 15 he was a full-fledged warrior and at 18 a corpse of the multiple battles in which the orc tribes were immersed before their entry into the Black Empire. They wandered through the interior of Tripulia. The magic business was very thriving, and it didn't just attract magicians. It attracted merchants and adventurers of all kinds who would sell the items found in their adventures to any wizard who offered a good price for them. It was about to get dark, so they stayed at the first inn they found. The next day Arian and Vanus would be separated from the rest of the group. The mercenaries had a meeting. They rented a room for themselves, and the mercenaries stayed in 3 adjoining rooms on the 2nd floor of the inn, dined there and then went to sleep. It was nice to rest in a bed again after almost 2 weeks of travel. Kush was left alone in the tavern, the wizard drinking some sweet wine as he flipped through his spell book. With a small pen he made some notes, as was usual with him. Sometimes he even drew some scenes. Without meaning to, an Arian came out with excited eyes when he saw the great towers of magic. It was innocence personified. Little did the young woman know how terrible Tripulia was. She turned the pages of her book backwards, as far as I had precise notes made 5 years ago. Duboc had recruited him for the company. Few mags acted as mercenaries and were of questionable behavior, so he was immediately recruited. But there was a problem. Duboc was very scrupulous with the rules and didn't want to have any problems with the Council of Mags. So he forced Kush to register with Tripulia and pass the exam necessary to practice as a magician. It wasn't really cumbersome, it was simply a matter of paying a kind of permit in the registry. The management was quickly processed by means of a bribe, and the examination was no more than a mere formality, requiring the payment of another bribe. Already Kush was disappointed with the wizards of the north. Everything had become a business to maintain his privileges, but he would never have thought that this went so far in a subject that in his homeland was sacred: necromancy. Magic can never be used to play with death or use evil forces in the magician's favor. Although magicians have always been on the latter side of the line. But as for necromancy, all over the world it was something persecuted, and it was because the goddess of death, Thani, was very scrupulous about this. Many who have played with her trying to deceive her have ended up cursed. So much so, that the story of the necromancer Aldomir was very famous. Except that there was one small detail that wasn't told in the traditional version of the story. Aldomir was a Grand Master of an order that was removed from Tripulia upon learning of its activities. The tower was torn to the ground, and mags fearful of Thani's wrath built a temple in honor of the goddess. But how do you fight necromancy? When it is rumored that most high wizards play with it, and Kush proved it at that time. The trip to Tripulia was a disappointment. Attempting to enter any tower of any order was impossible for him, as he was not a member of any of them, and the council's library only allowed access to books for apprentices. So trying to learn anything else was impossible for him. So he decided to spend one last night before returning to Almera, that night to say goodbye. He wanted to see how the towers twinkled under the light of the white moon that was in the full moon phase, a spectacle worth admiring. When he returned to the inn, he went into one of the alleys of Tripulia, infested with merchants, thieves, and prostitutes. Kush was dodging all kinds of propositions when in the background he saw something that was not normal, a blue glow, and as a young prostitute seemed to ask for help, the magician approached to see what it was. Their worst fears were realized. The young woman was being unceremoniously murdered by 2 men dressed in black. The magician stopped them and soon discovered the reality of Tripulia. Those men were necromancer magins who were dedicated to kidnapping or killing, and when they could not steal corpses, to sell their victims to magicians involved in black magic. There were 2 of them, one tall with straight black hair and the other plump and with a prominent mustache. The tall mag threw the girl to the ground and pulled out a sword. Kush was very fast in the art of summoning spells and always used his favorite called Lethal Lightning, a simple but tremendously effective spell that he used against the first Magin, who did not expect such a devastating attack and fell to the ground writhing in pain. His sidekick disappeared into the crowd. Kush approached the young woman, but she was already dead. What kind of spawn would kill a girl just for money? When he turned to examine the body of the fallen attacker, he had disappeared. The wizard was impressed. He had survived his attack, no doubt imbued with the power of death magic. He brought the terrible crime to the attention of the competent authorities, but what he found was total passivity. Albion's guard told him that what was happening within the walls of Tripulia was the business of the mags, and the council told him that they would investigate, but they did not send anyone. The wizard himself paid out of his own pocket for the funeral at the temple of Thani and investigated on his own. The victim was a young woman who had come from the south fleeing poverty to earn some gold at the expense of the young magic students. She had not been in the city very long. A perfect prey, it took him a lot of time and gold to find out the truth. There was a whole mafia dedicated to kidnapping and killing all kinds of victims to use them in dark rituals, but no one wanted to speak frankly. They were prey to fear. Rumor had it that they were very powerful, capable of capturing vampires, werewolves, and anyone if the price was right. What did the council do? Look the other way. The magicians themselves were his main clients, and this was a fact known to all. People took measures such as not going out alone at night, and if that happened they tried to be in very busy places and neighborhoods, but they were never completely safe inside the city of magic. Kush left Tripulia disgusted and told Dabok what he had observed. The warrior showed him a series of letters he had in his possession. They were from desperate parents, kings asking for help since in their kingdoms there were a number of inexplicable disappearances of their subjects. But the company did not take care of these cases. They were mercenaries who were experts in protection and low-profile missions, although with some special clients they had made some exceptions. Their investigations ended in nothing conclusive, but everything pointed to one place, Tripulia. Remembering all this, the magician closed the book tightly. What was created as a place of light was now a pit of corruption. Indignant, he went to bed. When the two young women woke up, the mercenaries had already disappeared. The innkeeper informed them that they had paid for their room and theirs for at least 2 more nights. So Arian was sure that he would see them again at least 1 more night. The young woman went out into the street. She knew where she had to go. The inn loaf had recommended to Nilam was the only clue she had. If it didn't work, he could always go to the White Robe's headquarters or to the Wizards' Council itself to report his case. Loaf's words still echoed in his head, river of wine, and Bippity the Fat. He asked the innkeeper about the situation of that inn. It turned out that it was not far away, going straight on the 2nd street on the right. Arian went out with Vanus to the premises. The young woman at first wanted to go alone, but the Kendeli did not give in. She even threatened to make herself invisible. In that scenario, Arian accepted that he went with her. They made their way slowly through the crowded streets. At this time they were at the beginning of the school year, and many new apprentices arrived in Tripulia with hopes of becoming magicians, but more than half would fail. Most of them ended up as Magins. A Magin was a person who had studied magic but had not completed them. What in ancient times was a cause of dishonor and many committed suicide was now a very profitable way of life for 2 reasons. The Magins could use weapons, something that magicians were forbidden to do, and combine it with the use of magic. A magician could not break that law, but Magins were not magicians in the strict sense. By paying the council gave the applicant permission to use magic. It had its limitations, since spells had to be simple, but it was a very lax rule. There were quite diligent Magins who served as bodyguards and mercenaries. In fact, they were the security force of the Council of Mags. They were dedicated to searching for mags convicted of necromancy, and of some order, although this was unofficial. Others opted to make potions of all kinds or act as healers. The few who were dedicated to the dark but lucrative world of necromancy and black magic, they were referred to as Black Magins. For someone as strict as Kush, the existence of the Magins was the height of Tripulia's degeneration. Fortunately, Dabok hated the Magins. He had none at his service, only 3 mags. However, even to be a master, you had to study a lot, not just talent. Despite the commotion, it didn't take long for him to find the inn. The sign was quite large and with golden letters already worn by the passage of time, the River of Wine. It was a shabby and unkempt place, the worst of all the ones he had visited during his trip. The tavern of Ordoni compared to this place was a palace. The windows were dirty, greasy and mouldy. The place did not have a door, so the entrance appeared in front of them, inviting them to enter into a very disconcerting gloom. Arian entered hesitantly. It was a large place with 2 floors. As usual, the ground floor was used as a tavern and the second floor was an inn. The tavern had seen better days, no doubt, with a long wooden bar behind which stood an obese and bald tavern keeper who stared at a number of round tables irregularly placed in the room, around each of them many stools. The clientele must have been very numerous, but not at that moment. I only had 2 customers whispering to each other at one of the tables in the back. The innkeeper gave a look of disbelief towards Arian. It was not at all usual to see a young woman enter this place unaccompanied. He stopped cleaning the bar with a huge dirty black rag. "Good morning." Arian greeted politely. "That depends on who it is for." "Are you Bipedi?" "Yes, that's my name." The innkeeper didn't seem very willing to converse. His gaze wandered to his customers in the background who seemed to be too busy with their affairs. "I am looking for a young apprentice magician. I arrive recommended by Loaf, the one-eyed, an old friend of his. He came from the north and his name is Nilam. Are you here, please?" The innkeeper became much more annoyed and spat on the ground. "That is no longer here." The news hit Arian like a bucket of cold water. It was the only hope of finding his brother. "I understand. Do you know in what order you study magic?" "That bum. A student of magic. He is not even good for a man who prepares manure. Forgive me, but that scoundrel lost the desire to be a magician as soon as he saw the terrible trials he had to undergo. A new disappointment, all the clues she had seemed to be useless. Nilam doesn't study magic. That gulf, he dropped out of school a few months later. He did study something. He spent all the gold he had on parties and living the high life with his actor friends. He was working here, if that can be called working. Nilam had not left a fond memory in Bipedi's memory. Sleep the monkey and drink my best beer on the sly, until one day I got fed up with his farts and kicked him out. I owed Loaf some favors, but not so many, and he still owes me gold. Know if Nilam is still in Tripulia?" "Yes, I think so. He lives next to those bums like him. They say they're artists, but they're just bottle huggers. Now he's an artist too. A word of advice, don't get together with that guy. The only thing they will get out of you is all the gold you have to spend on your vices." The innkeeper spoke in good faith, but Arian had to see his brother. "He's my brother and I must see him. It's urgent." "Do you know where you are?" Bipedi raised one of his eyebrows. Nilam's sister. He thought that she was one of his lovers scorned or swindled by the young man in one of his many love affairs. She had a great talent for such tasks. "Those damned ones are in the north of the city. There is a wasteland outside the walls where a kind of fair is located. Those who have nothing else to do but waste time laughing at graces and numbers come. They call themselves the merry actors of the wasteland. Now they must be dozing off after a busy night. But trust me, your brother will only look for trouble for you." Arian smiled and as payment for his services gave the innkeeper a gold coin for the information. "Don't worry, he already gave them to me even before he joined that troupe of actors." She was furious. She had risked everything for a bum. Nilam was never a hard worker, but she had always finished everything she started. It is true that in Caesarea there were not all the distractions that existed in Tripulia, or it was the image she had of Nilam and not the real one. Arian was a sea of doubts, but there was only one person who could clear them up, his brother. Fortunately, Vanus knew the wasteland of Tripulia, the name given to the place on the outskirts of the city that was enriched by those who abandoned their magical vocation or who wanted a break from so much study. Of course, with the tolerance of the Council of Magicians in exchange for a tax. The magicians settled everything with gold. The company was quite famous. The Kendali knew it. They advanced through the busy streets of Tripulia to the north gate. There was the wasteland where a huge fair was located with multiple tents of all colors. And now at the end of summer it was the peak time of the fair, with all those new apprentices. Even people came to Tripulia from the capital of Albiona itself to come to the fair. Almost all the fairgrounds were seasonal. In winter they used to go south, but not all of them anymore. The company of the merry actors of the wasteland had long had a fixed residence in Tripulia, although with them it was never known the same. One day they would pitch the tent and move elsewhere. At this time the fair was empty like the Bipedi premises. It was at dusk when it was at its peak. They asked 2 or 3 people and located the tent belonging to the theatre company. A brightly colored, rectangular-looking tent. The entrance was guarded by a dwarf who slept peacefully sitting on a stool. He must have been the watchman, but the stench of alcohol he gave off as he approached indicated that he was in no position to watch anything other than his own verticality. The 2 went inside the tent. It was a huge stage with wooden benches where the audience Saturday. Arian followed the Kendali, who was well acquainted with the layout of such a theatre. In the background were the dressing rooms that usually served as the actors' homes. They entered the first one they found. It was a large room full of lounge chairs and bunk beds where the actors and actresses snoozed. They were very sleepy. The night before it must have been moved. It was difficult to recognize Nilam in those conditions, but in front of them they found a beautiful half-elf standing, who looked at them with some hostility. "What do you want?" "Sorry for the intrusion. We are looking for a young man who recently joined your company in this city." "Nilam?" "No." The half-elf's tone was not good at all. "If it's my brother, please, it's urgent. It's ogre spawn is there." The half-elf pointed to a room separated from the rest with wooden walls. "She told me she would love me forever and now she is with that old witch. Nilam is troll shit." The half-elf disappeared, coming out of the curtain, pushing Arian with her shoulder before the astonished gaze of the 2. Arian was beginning to understand that the innkeeper's claims about his brother's lively love life were true. Without cutting a hair, the young woman opened the door without knocking. She was impatient to see her brother. She found a room decorated with some luxury. It must have been someone important within the company. In the bed there were 2 people who were lying sleeping in each other's arms. A middle-aged but very beautiful woman, with dark hair and elegant bearing. The other was a young man with tousled hair. He was a little fatter than when he lived in Caesarea, and he wore 2 gold earrings in his right ear. He had a very different image of the young apprentice who had left Caesarea almost 2 years ago. Arian couldn't contain his excitement and screamed excitedly. "Nilam! Are you okay?" The sleepers were startled at Arian's cry of joy. The woman looked at the 2 strangers in surprise but immediately reacted angrily against Nilam. "Shameless! That you'd never fool me again. You're a liar." The cake on Nilam's face was heard from outside the room. The young man couldn't react. As the woman had barely opened her eyes, she was indignantly leaving the room with a robe on without paying attention to the 2 girls. "Old witch, get out of here. You'll come back like you all do. Besides, Madame Leonore is coming back from her trip today, and I don't need you anymore." Nilam went back to sleep. Arian was surprised. Her brother had not 2 lovers but 3. In Caesarea her brother had never behaved like that, at least that she knew. Nilam wakes up at once. Arian was angry with her brother. He opened his eyes to close them again and then opened them wide. Now he had recognized the stranger who called him. "Arian! My girl! What are you doing here?" Her brother was glad to see her, quickly got out of bed and hugged his sister. They continued to hug each other for a few minutes while the Kendali was a spectator of the scene. "Nilam, you're fine. I was very worried about you. Thank the gods nothing has happened to you." Arian was crying with emotion. He had gone through so much hardship to get to this moment. "Little sister, what are you doing here? Has something happened in Caesarea? Is Master Loaf okay?" "Loaf has disappeared. Some magicians came asking for him. They said I had stolen something. They tried to interrogate me to betray you." "Betray me? Nilam exclaimed. Loaf gave you a jewel just before you left Caesarea. The mags are looking for that jewel, white robes. A jewel? Nilam didn't seem to understand his sister. If a piece of jewelry emits a blue glow, remember. Loaf told you that it was very valuable, that you only sell it in case of dire need. A blue jewel, don't worry, I've already sold it. So don't worry. You sold it. Arian was paralyzed. She had risked everything for that jewel to be sold as a vulgar trinket. She pushed her brother away angrily. You sold it. Tripulia was not what I expected, sister. Loaf's letter was a failure. I managed to get into the Magic Academy of the Order of the Purple Brothers. It's not one of the most important orders, but its teachings were very hard, very hard. We had to learn hundreds of phrases every day, and I had to work until the wee hours of the morning in that filthy slum in Bipedi. Nilam lay down on the bed and Arian stroked her hair tenderly. After 2 months I realized that magic was too hard, so ungrateful, that I gave it up. Tripulia has so many things to see and do. After a few months I abandoned Bipedi, and so did his complaints and expletives. I tasted all the pleasures and realized that acting is the most important thing of all. But this life has expenses, a lot of expenses to ingratiate myself with my actor brothers, and for them to accept me you have to spend a lot of gold. I sold the jewel in the first few months so I could live in a decent way. But magic is not sister life. When you see those magicians are bitter, when the theatre gives you a much more real vision of life and with fewer sacrifices. Haven't you had any problems with the white robes? Those stiff people. They didn't even let me go near their tower to submit an application for admission. They said I wasn't dignified. There are too many apprentices in Tripulia and I dropped out of school. I'm nobody for them. But they said they knew you. I've never spoken in a white robe. Sister, I'm fine. Come back to see me tomorrow and I'll invite you to lunch, then you'll be a spectator of our special function. Madame Leonore comes back today. She's the owner of the company and she wants me to be her lead actor. Arian was furious. All sacrifices were in vain. Nilam is unconscious. He had sold the jewel at the first opportunity. She left the room crying, accompanied by the Kendali. Nilam was lying down. His sister was here for the jewel. No doubt it was very valuable then. She had to ask for more gold, much more. He loved his sister, but it was necessary to deceive her. Just now she had to show up. Tonight, when Nilam would close a deal that would make him incredibly rich. With that gold, his sister would surely forgive him, and then they would travel together all over Shanaris. The young man got up and went to a trunk at the back of the room, removed the magic padlock that could only be opened with the touch of his hand. Inside there was only one thing, the only thing he hadn't sold since his arrival in Tripulia. He was still inside the leather sack Loaf had given him. Nilam pulled the jewel out of it, and it emitted a faint blue glow. Nilam was also not honest with Arian on another matter. The buyer of his jewel was a white robe. Perhaps it was too many coincidences. Perhaps his sister was right that he was in danger, but a chest full of gold coins was too tempting for him. In addition, the white robe was recommended by a friend of his, a friendship forged in the underbelly of the City of Magic. Arian took a long walk through the city of Tripulia with the Kendali who accompanied her in silence. The disappointment was so great, sold like a vulgar tomato at the first sign of change, to stop being a magician for a simple actor with the amount of sacrifices made by the humble people of Caesarea to finance the trip. Well, maybe it would be better that way. With the jewel lost in any place from 3 to 4, now for the white robes it would be almost impossible to find it. It was already dusk when they returned to the inn. They found the mercenaries having dinner. Apparently the meeting with the Council of Mags was quite productive. Gosberg was glad to see them and received them very effusively. "Dear, come and have dinner with us, we are happy. Today we will work. It will be an easy and well-paid assignment." Kush looked at the Denka with some reproach. he certainly wasn't being very discreet about what suited them. Tripulia was not a safe place, full of scoundrels everywhere. The Denka ignored the magician's disapproving glances and continued. If you want, I think you can join us, you will find it very interesting. This really stunned all the mercenaries, it was absolute madness. Will you come, my dear? The Denka insisted again. I don't think it's convenient, I think Aris and Kush don't like the idea. Arian had no desire to live new experiences, that night he had enough with the disappointment of his brother's meeting. I don't think Aris bothers you about your company, why not, boss? The half-orc looked with some disdain at the Denka. It was evident that it was an awkward situation, but what Arian did not know was that the superior of Aris was Gosberg since he was the oldest member. He could not contradict an order from the Denka, but both Arian and the Kendali were inexperienced in combat, although the mission was very simple and not dangerous. If you want, but you'll take care of his safety, if anything happens, you'll be accountable to the Boke. Arian was surprised, she didn't want to go, but now that she had been invited she couldn't refuse. Don't worry, Aris, everything will go on normally. Besides, Agnorak can help me. The other half-orc raised his head. Gosberg is always tangling things up, he was nonsense. I hope so. Aris was terse with the answer. Silence reigned at the table, it was a real surprise that the girls accompanied them, but no one wanted to say anything. Kush spent a long time watching the Denka. That he was up to something was obvious, but it was impossible to uncover a plan by Gosberg. You'd have to do what you'd always do, go with the flow and see what happened. Arian didn't look up during the whole dinner either, he didn't want to observe the gazes of the mercenaries, although as the minutes went by the situation returned to a certain normality. At the end of dinner, Aris and Kush talked to the young woman and the Kendali about how they should behave. The first to speak was the magician. You must stay calm, the work is simple. In a nearby alley the Council of Magicians knows that the sale of a magical object of great value is going to take place. We were lucky enough to arrive in Tripulia yesterday to tell the truth. The Council does not want that magical object to fall into dangerous hands but does not want to be directly involved in the event. Don't worry, they have informed us who wants to make the exchange and they are no match for us. You just have to be in the rear, and if the situation gets complicated, always stay by Gosberg and Agnorak's side, heeding their instructions. Gosberg is a life insurance policy in these cases, don't part with it. They waited until midnight before leaving, everything had come together, it was fortunate that they arrived just in time for the exchange without a doubt, although something smelled strange to Kush. If it was something so easy, why hire some mercenaries when the Council had enough resources to at least kill some half-scoundrels? Something wasn't right. The alley was also not far from the inn where they were staying, as always the streets were overflowing. They were placed at their posts, the order was not to attack until the exchange was complete. Arian, Vanis and Gosberg took a position closer to the exit of the alley. In case there was trouble the escape was easier, the meeting point was the inn. Agnorak was next to Sabu in the main street, they covered the rear in case it was a trap, simple missions always brought surprises. Arian was covered by large boxes, the drawback being that he only had a partial view of the alley. Time passed slowly and it did not seem that the information of the magicians was going to be fulfilled. Many times there are murmurs and those involved cancel the exchange. Gosberg seemed impatient enough and was about to give up when they heard footsteps coming into the alley. Arian couldn't see who came in, since he was talking to the Kendali at the time. Gosberg reproached them for their carelessness. Please. Silence. I don't want Aris to gruel Denka meat. Again time passed slowly, the alley was plunged into an unearthly silence from the outside, the hustle and bustle of the street arrived, the silence was interrupted by the nervous footsteps of the person who had just entered. It seemed that they were delaying their appointment. After a few minutes they heard other footsteps entering the alley, this time Arian could see well who entered. He could not believe it, it was a couple, a thin man dressed in black and a magician in white robes, Doris. A bad hunch was beginning to emerge like a black shadow within him. It's about time, it's not a very comfortable place. A voice familiar to Arian complained, though she wasn't entirely sure. Don't worry, my friend, everything is taken care of. It's a safe place and soon you'll see so much gold that you won't go back to a place like that for the rest of your life. I hope so, gold. It was Nilam, impossible, his brother would never lie to him. The jewel. Here it is, what about the gold? We have 2 partners outside with the chest, they will enter when you show us the jewel. Nilam was nervous, he didn't like how this was getting, the chest wasn't there, now he had no choice. All or nothing, he slipped the bag from his pants pocket and then placed the jewel on his hand. It did something strange, it shone more intensely than it normally did. To his surprise, it also burned him a little. Arian, recognizing his brother, came out of his hiding place and could see the scene, the trio contemplating how the jewel sparkled. Give us the jewel now, the man ordered. Nilam thought to say something but Doris sang aloud some verses and a green lightning bolt hit the young man's chest causing him to fall to the ground. The jewel as it fell to the ground was losing its bluish shine. Arian's brother convulsed loudly as Doris made her way toward the jewel. Nilam! Arian shouted lamentingly. Doris turned, it was as if he saw a ghost. The other man drew his sword and began to mumble something. You? How did you get there? Doris spoke no more, as a dagger pierced his forehead and he died instantly. Arian was perplexed, she had never seen anything so fast. It was Gosberg who was next to her. The other man tried to reach the jewel, it was useless, a lightning bolt launched by Kush stopped him, but the man must have known the use of magic since with a kind of red ribbon he managed to contain the lightning. Although he could not react to Ara's greatsword, an elegant and simple blow, the edge of the sword entered the right side upwards penetrating to the heart. Death was instantaneous. Agnorak and Sabu, seeing lightning, entered the alley, running towards Arian to protect her, but the young woman cared little. As soon as Doris had passed away, she went to comfort her brother who lay dead with his eyes rolling. The mercenaries dispersed looking for more of the dead's cronies, but it seemed that only the couple was involved in this exchange. Kush examined Nilam's corpse, then rose to speak to Aris, Gosberg, and Agnorak. A death ray, he has undone it inside, it takes about 6 minutes to perform the entire conjuration, they planned to kill him from the beginning. It is a typical incantation of white robes. Arian kept crying comforted by the Kendali, she would never forgive herself for this failure. Nilam was a fool, but she should never have left him alone. If she had been with him now her brother would be alive. Aris and Agnorak were looking at the other man's corpse, and were joined by Kush. I know this guy. Gosberg walked over to the trio and looked at Kush. 5 years ago in this same city I saw how he murdered a prostitute. I managed to wound him, but he escaped. He is a black man. From the little I could find out he was dedicated to supplying anything that necromancers need. The Denkga examined the corpse. Well-fed, new clothes, it must be a profitable business and the clientele must be very powerful. Agnorak examined the sword, it was of good workmanship, no trinket. What's a guy mixed with necromancy doing next to a white robe? Aris was silent, he took the blue jewel, which began to shine again, it was the object they had to recover. It must be something very important. Kush shook his head. That's why they hired us. A white robe next to a black magin is such a scandal that not even the Council of Mags itself will be able to cover it this time. Black magic is within the most important order of mercenaries. The quartet watched as Arian wept over his brother's corpse. One more surprise, what a Gosberg occurrence. The Denkga lit a cigarette but said nothing. Agnorak spoke. The Kendali says he is her brother. Arian was traveling to Tripulia to visit him. Too many coincidences. Aris was surprised. Kush examined the magician's robe to see if he could find anything that would shed more light on the matter, but nothing. Agnorak was then that he remembered that he had seen this guy in Tame. This wizard was chasing Arian in Tame. It was shortly after meeting her that she managed to escape from him. Everyone fell silent. Aris spoke. Arian came to warn his brother. The Council of Mags had not been very clear with them either. They told them about the exchange between 3 people and that they should prevent it with the means they deemed appropriate and recover the object. They didn't tell them anything about a white robe and a black Magin. This is all very strange. The Council of Magicians owes us an explanation. Kush sat up. Doris had nothing of value. I don't think the Wizard Council will give you explanations. They will surely cover everything up and keep the item. Well, I think they're going to have to do it this time. Agnorak kicked the ground as he approached the young woman to comfort her. Kush went to find some wagons so that they could take the corpses and leave them in the Temple of Thani. They would only take care of Arian's brother. Aris and Gosberg were left alone. Gosberg spoke too calmly as he lit another cigarette. Arian's brother is dead. There is an order of necromancers operating in Tripulia with impunity, surely with some dark objective, and the Council of Mags is going to refuse to collaborate with us. First we must bury Arian's brother, and then... Gosberg was draining his cigarette. Aris had to consult the Denka. We will ask the magicians for explanations if they want the jewel. Aris remained silent. That was breaking the contract. Debok won't like it, but Gosberg was the superior in command. And if they force us to hand it over the hard way? Gosberg smiled slightly and just one sentence full of confidence. There is no spell faster than a dagger. The conversation ended as a wagon commanded by Kush took the bodies to the Temple of Thani. The rest of the mercenaries accompanied a disconsolate Arian to the inn where she wept for her unfortunate brother until dawn.